Okay, it sounds like everyone's ready. Thank you, everyone, for being here. My name is Ken Stewart. I'm the Associate Dean of Communications and Public Programs here at the GSD, and we're very pleased to be here with Seth and Tat to share and celebrate their new book, Thinking Through Soil, Wastewater Agriculture in the Mesquital Valley. Thinking Through Soil is the second title that we've released or are in the process of releasing through our small and relatively new book imprint here at the GSD, Harvard Design Press, which I organize and edit together with Marielle Suba, who's over at the table to your left. Just a few words about the book. To think through soil is to engage with some of the most critical issues of our time. In addition to its agricultural role in feeding 8 billion people, soil is the primary agent of carbon storage in global climate models, and it is crucial for biodiversity, flood control, and freshwater resources. Perhaps no other material is asked to do so much for the human environment, and yet our basic conceptual model of what soil is and how it works remains surprisingly vague. Through a sustained analysis of the world's largest wastewater agricultural system, located in the Mexico City Mesquital hydrological region, Thinking Through Soil imagines what a better environmental future might look like in Central America. And more broadly, it is a case study that captures soil's shifting identity, explains its profound importance to rural and urban life, and argues for its capacity to save our planet. And Seth and Tat, of course, will say much more about the project in just a few moments. I want to share a few special thanks. First to Anita Beres-Beitia, who was the chair of the Landscape Architecture Department when this project was initiated, and she's also on the editorial board for Harvard Design Press. And I also want to thank and recognize Chad Klupfer and Willis Kingery for their amazing design of the book, which is quite beautiful, but also really brings out, I think, the rich nuance and complexity of what Seth and Tat are trying to do. I also want to thank the SOM Foundation Research Prize, which supported the book. Of course, Dean Sarah Whiting for her support of this project and of the school's publication activities generally. And last but certainly not least, I want to thank Seth and Tat for bringing this project to us in the first place, and for what has been a very rewarding collaboration and experience for all of us here at the GSD these past few years. And in developing the project into what we are here to share. So this is how things are going to go. I'm going to introduce all of our speakers, and then Seth and Tat are going to come up here and give an overview of the book, and then Gary Hilderbrand will join them in conversation about the project. So, for some formal introductions, Montserrat Bonvehi is a licensed Spanish architect and urban designer. She was the 2018 Daniel Urban Kiley Fellowship here at the GSD, and has taught landscape architecture at the University of Virginia and the urban design department at the ETSAP in Barcelona. Seth Denizen is a recipient of the 2019 SOM Foundation Research Prize and a Princeton Mellon Fellow in Architecture, Urbanism, and the Humanities. He's a researcher and design practitioner trained in landscape architecture, evolutionary biology, and human geography. And last but not least, Gary Hilderbrand, I think needs no introduction, but is the Peter Lewis Hornbeck Professor in Practice of Landscape Architecture and Chair of the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the GSD. In addition to having taught at the school since 1990, he is also a founding principal of the firm Reed Hilderbrand, based here in Cambridge, which has been responsible for significant works of landscape architecture at the Sterling and Francine Clark Art Institute, at McDowell, at MIT, and the Arnold Arboretum, and I think a big major project at Storm King coming up, opening next month. Yes. So one final note, we had planned to have copies of this book for sale, on pre-sale here today, and they were supposed to arrive last week, and that all seemed very possible up until yesterday. What's happened is that they've been detained by the Coast Guard, and we hope to have them here sometime soon, and I think at that point we'll just be able to make them available for sale here in the Loeb Library. So I apologize for that, but it really is has been out of our hands. So yeah, without further ado, Seth and Tat.
Hi, everyone. We are super excited to be here. We also want to start by thanking Ken and Marielle. They have been amazing in the project. Also Chad and Willis, that even if I always was fighting with line weights, they were amazing in the design. But it's who I am, and as designers, we try to think that we can design anything, and it's not true. We also want to thank Iker Hill from the SOM Foundation, because without that started the project 5 or 6 years ago, this would not be here today. And then also Anita and Sarah, that from the moment that we received the prize and the award, they were super supportive, and it was COVID and everything changed all our plans, and instead of traveling, now we have a book. Maybe that is a good treat. Instead of taking the students to the site, we now bring you the book and you all can go to the site. And finally, Gary, for being here and willing to talk about us and with us about the book. And I think probably that's enough thanks for now.
Yeah, so the way that we're going to do this is I'm going to start by giving a kind of brief overview of the case, the kind of case study, and then I'm going to pass it over to Tat, who's going to also kind of expand on the way in which the book is not just a description of a site, but that it's also a kind of a methodology that we've been sort of developing. So there's kind of two simultaneous stories that we're trying to tell. And the first part that I'm going to do is, I apologize, but I'm going to be reading because the case study, as you're going to see, is quite complex. And we've really tried to distill it down to a tight 12 minutes, because otherwise I could just kind of start talking and look up, and it would be the sun would be going down and things like that. So I'm going to try to keep it really tight for you guys. So I'm just going to kind of give you an overview of this particular case study, which in some sense I could talk about as a kind of cartography of entanglement. What you're seeing here is Mexico City on the bottom and the Valle de Mezquital on the top. And as you can see, they're connected. And the way in which they've been connected is really crucial to the story that we're telling. So in 1901, Mexico City built a canal to remove sewage and wastewater from the city. It was called the Gran Canal, which connected it hydrologically to the Mezquital Valley for the first time. And as the city grew, so did the Mezquital Valley as kind of mirror images of one another. So the city kind of becoming increasingly dry, and the Mezquital Valley becoming increasingly wet as it filled with new irrigation canals and more farmland. By 1990, the population of Mexico City had expanded exponentially and was now sending enough wastewater to the Mezquital Valley to irrigate around 80,000 hectares, or what here is around 200,000 acres of agricultural land. Today, that number is close to 250,000 acres. And instead of the kind of lazy surface stream that trickled out of the city in 1901, there are now these kind of enormous subsurface pipes that shoot wastewater into the valley at 60 cubic meters a second. And these pipes are collectively known as the drenaje profundo, or deep drainage of the city. So if we take a look at the kind of topographic boundary of the Basin of Mexico, which you can see here as a dotted line, the function of these pipes is to drain the city's floodwaters in the rainy season and to evacuate its untreated sewage. And all of that sewage goes to the Mezquital Valley, where it's used for agriculture. And this is how the system has worked, really, for over a century, operating as the world's largest and longest running wastewater agriculture system, really until the 2000s, when the Mexican government started to repay what it called its historic debt to the Mezquital Valley and build Latin America's largest wastewater treatment plant at the end of these pipes, called the Atontonilco Wastewater Treatment Plant, which you can see here, Atontonilco PTAR. But the project has run into some unexpected resistance. In November of 2018, several thousand farmers organized a protest in front of its, sort of newly painted entrance that it had just completed, and they formed a barricade, and they began reading a list of demands. But I think for many of us, certainly in a country like the United States, where we have this kind of system of wastewater treatment plants, the demands were not really what you might be expecting. So for instance, the demand was not to place the treatment plant somewhere else, like for instance on the Mexico City side of the pipe, which would be logical. Rather, the demand was for the treatment plant to actually stop treating the water entirely. Not treating it here in the Mezquital, not treating it anywhere. So opposing treated water in a region that suffers from wastewater pathogens and enteric diseases, it's an argument that is difficult to make, and it certainly doesn't lend itself to sound bites, right? To the media at the time, this kind of euphemism of aguas negras, or black water, didn't really fully obscure the kind of black humor of the underlying accusation that the government was stealing the people's shit. Confusingly, this also happened in the middle of the Mexican fuel crisis. So, in some sense, instead of stealing the most valuable resource in the nation with incredible cunning, like the fuel, they were accusing the government of stealing the most valueless material by means of this enormously expensive and complex machine, which you see here in this image called Atontonilco. So this is essentially the impasse that the region finds itself in today. The government sees itself as having repaid a historic debt to the Mezquital Valley by cleaning it up after a century of neglect, but farmers see a different kind of debt entirely. For the farmers, the federal government is effectively converting the government's historical debt to the Mezquital Valley into financial debt by forcing them to buy fertilizer that used to come in the wastewater for free. So in short, the wastewater offered a real significant subsidy, and now farmers feel like they're being impoverished in the name of public health. So rather than feel grateful for the government's repayment of their perceived historic debt, they actually feel silenced and patronized by a kind of reductive concept of what health should look like in their community. Reductive because it prioritizes addressing certain kinds of toxicity. We might call them the kind of charismatic pathogens that produce acute illness over others like heavy metals, industrial chemicals, air pollution, and farm debt that are more likely to produce chronic conditions. Because after a sort of $1 billion spent on this treatment plant, Atontonilco can't actually remove the heavy metals. And I'm going to say more about that a little later. But first, there's another kind of crucial part of this story of sort of contested entanglements, which is that this is not actually the first time that farmers in the Mezquital have found their bodies, their agricultural practices, or their form of life as an object of medical concern. Thank you. So in 1976, the Mexican filmmaker Paul Leduc made this incredible documentary. This is the poster for it here, called Etnocidio, Notas sobre el Mezquital. And the film opens with this funeral of a child. And a slow kind of procession that you see here winds up this arid mountainside of cactus and agave as a man balances a small white casket on his shoulder. And we never learn how exactly this child died. But later in the film, Leduc will tell us that 70% of child mortality in the Mezquital Valley is due to communicable diseases like tuberculosis, and there's less than one doctor per 3,000 inhabitants. And as a portrait of the Mezquital Valley, Leduc's film is a kind of catalog of scenes of immiseration bridged by tense interviews with the valley's Otomi, or Ñañu, indigenous group. In 1976, the Mezquital Valley was a famously poor region in Mexico, maybe the most famously poor region, and the Otomi were a symbol of its extremes, defining for most urban Mexicans the limit of what was imaginable as rural poverty. Starting in the 1930s, the Otomi were primary research subjects for famous Mexican anthropologists like Manuel Gamio and a succession of presidential administrations who wanted to solve what every government in the Americas, including our government here, had taken to calling the Indian problem. During this time, the Otomi were subjected to really kind of every conceivable type of test, biological and cultural tests. And of course, right at this period, there was very little distinction between the biological and the cultural. A delegation of French and Mexican eugenicists measured their basal metabolic rate to make claims about indigenous lethargy and stupidity. And in the study you see here from 1961, the faces of indigenous people were studied as biological expressions of inner psychological defects, revealing sadness, distrust, indifference, and docility as typical indigenous afflictions. And at this time, the Indian problem, simply expressed, was a fear that modern economic development was incompatible with indigenous forms of life. And this made indigenous people a drag on things like national progress and the GDP. The solution was therefore to foreclose these forms of life through economic and cultural assimilation. Many of the tactics incentivizing assimilation are sort of documented by Leduc and Bartra in Etnocidio, the film that I was showing you in the 1970s. But for the influential anthropologist and government advisor Manuel Gamio, the primary tool for transforming the Mezquital Valley was irrigation. Irrigation would change indigenous diets from primitive corn to energy-rich soybeans. It was the solution to their famously poor hygiene, famous for anthropologists, which of course, those anthropologists had made the Otomi famous for since the 1930s when they reported that the Otomi don't take baths because there's not enough water, right? Arid climate. It was also the solution for their diseases, which were a result of their faith in shamans and healers. It would teach them Spanish when they brought their goods to market. In short, irrigation was really the beginning and the end of the Indian problem for Manuel Gamio, who also believed, contrary to many of his eugenicist colleagues, that it actually had the power to racially convert indigenous people into Creoles. And today, when we look around, this kind of stunning verdant green scene, this majestic reservoir called Endo Sewage Reservoir, which is fed by the Drenaje Profundo and acts as the world's largest lake of sewage. It basically maintains the correct timing and volume of wastewater for the Mezquital Valley's irrigation system. It's actually easy to forget that this reservoir was built to, quote, irrigate the indigenous zone of the Mezquital Valley, unquote. And this history forms the basis of what I would call a kind of biopolitical amnesia in the Mezquital Valley. There appears to be no memory among government water managers that irrigation canals were supposed to be the solution to the problem of health and hygiene in the Mezquital Valley, rather than the cause of all their problems, right? So irrigation arrived in the 1950s, waving the flag of public health on behalf of indigenous people, and then suddenly in 2014, it's public health that's now horrified by irrigation. So while Otomi farmers in the Mezquital have always been subject to kind of, what we might call state-imposed necropolitical violence that pathologizes their form of life as dirty, the strange fact is that the definition of dirt keeps changing in the Mezquital. What was clean in 1952 is now dirty today. So the question is, what should we do? How should we respond to this particular kind of complex environmental condition. How do we imagine the environmental future of the Mezquital in this place, where you have these contradictory forces creating an environmental condition with a set of politics that's now articulated over a contest over soil? And to try to do that, we really began this project to produce this book. And this book became a sort of a methodology for thinking through how we might imagine an environmental future in this particular place.
So, I will not try to not read, and I will try to explain almost how we not only think about the book, I think, how we actually work in these very complex, environments, and how do we think as designers, knowing that all the research that needs to be done, and how we translate that research, into something that many times cannot be a design. So I will explain you or try to go an overview of almost 3 main methodologies that we think the book has, but also explains a lot about in the way that we both work or we try to approach projects as well. So I will start by what I call new language or new representational system. So as designers, So most of our language happens through drawing. So we draw to understand, and we try to develop this new representational system of soil. Why? Because if we look back to this map here of the irrigation system of the Mezquital, in fact, it's the result of 100 years, it's a soil map of 100 years of irrigation, but at the same time fails to explain many of the things that happen here. So at this point, we start a new, system of representation that we call the soil characters. And for you, this is introduced almost at the beginning in the introduction of the book, because each of these soil characters is the result of understanding both material processes that already happen in the soil or chemical process, but also processes of change, most of the time anthropogenic change that could happen directly on that site or are the result of the wastewater that arrive to the site. So those are the soil characters are these new inputs that the book has, that you can read through and understand many different things in depth. So then they all are recombined in this soil profile, that it's each of the origins of the book. And it's the collection or this compound of the collection of all these elements, that we can read very complex, but at the same very simple, because it's the addition of all these elements together and how they, how we look into the soil in a different way. So in here, you go from these clay materials that are the result of this, the volcanic soil that was at the Mezquital in an arid environment. And this, you can see, for instance, each of the origins keep changing and it keeps adding into the pile of the soil. This is a kind of a favorite because it's about food, and it's the escamoles and how these escamoles live under the agave plants, and how people takes out the plant, removes every year the larvae, and when they are very skilled, returns it to the soil, compacts it, and they can come back next year. So there is these strategies that happen in the Mezquital that are about knowledge and indigenous knowledge. And in here you have how a place with 400 millimeters of rain produces incredible amounts of fiber. It's because they understand the use of the fibers coming from the maguey plants and other and how the fibers are extracted to make ayate. and here I keep moving you around, finally is this soil character, the sacred maguey, the maguey is the center of the life. It's a plant that sits in the edge of the fields, slowly growing 15 years, and then extracting more than 500 liters of pulque, that it's this high protein fermented fermented drinks that in different recounts, it's explained that was substitute in moments of a lot of drought in the area. It was used as drinking water. So it's a substitute of a meal and a drink at the same time. Yeah. And then, oops, is this? So the next methodology that we can think of is reading the book in two directions, we call it. So the book basically, and I will start passing you, this hopefully we'll be flipping through the pages, and you can see, So the structures, we are not graphic designers. This is why we had incredible Chad and Willis helping us. But basically the book can be read in two different ways. You can read what is the main piece that mostly recounts part of, or a good brief introduction that Seth did along all the three soil horizons. But at the same time, you have the sides, where the sides appear these soil characters that I introduced you, that are new stories that go deep into something that was impossible to be collected in the main narrative. It takes you to, not rabbit holes, but, incredibly deep, straightforward moments of this history that was impossible to be put, kind of in the mainstream of the story. So, and then the final one, I would say that is what I call moving away from the object and discovering a new soil horizon. So the book, for most of the time, I think for the first draft or more, I don't know if Ken and Marielle can remember this, but it was these two parts that was basically what we call the story and then kind of our dreams, or what is the future, because as designers we were saying, okay, let's be projective. And we had this editorial meeting and we were like, this is not working, why are we separating those? And then in an aha moment, I would say, we said, why we are not proposing the fourth horizon? And our fourth horizon in the book, that is the final part of the book, what it's doing, it's moving away from giving solutions as an object like this, and it's basically, finding all new and transformed soil characters that we think will play an incredible role for the future of the mesquital. And those can be, looking at how the organic compounds are bounded, are bounding the heavy metals. And then how, how prescribed, the two most prescribed antibiotic in Mexico City have two different half-life, which means how much active that is. And if we were prescribing one instead of the other, the time that this stays active in the soil change completely to prevent or to try to prevent antibiotic resistance in the soil. And, substituting metformin. And then I'm going to just go to a final one, that it's refining this dry land diet. It's a diet that has been there for 400 years, and it's a diet that talks about the traditions of caring about the landscape, knowing that the landscape is arid, but the landscape can give you almost everything that you need, and trying to recover that idea of how we make sustainable living in our territories. And I think with that, we will leave it here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Ken and Sarah and Anita, for prioritizing a topic like this in your press, our press. I have the privilege of having one of these. I have to talk about the book itself a little bit. First of all, I often have title envy. The title of this book, and I have it with you guys. Actually, before I do that, I have to say welcome back. And there are a bunch of people in the room who miss you badly.
Oh,
Because you were both such fantastic teachers while you were here, taught for quite a long time. And
yes.
well, finally, in order to do this project, they decided they had to live together. So, that was our loss, but they're still part of our family. In my office library, I have probably about a dozen or 15 books on soil. And we use them a lot. Soil is vital. Ken said it kind of beautifully. Soil is vital to everything we do. We move earth, we plant, we manage, we maintain. None of those books looks anything like this. They look like textbooks. You know, the big milestone, Urban Soils, Philip Krall, who taught here for a dozen years. I had actually studied with him in undergraduate school. This has the feel of a missile to me. It's almost newsprint, something, you know, uncoated paper. As you mentioned, there are several ways to read the book, and I hate endnotes, but I love footnotes, especially when they're an entire column on the page. I'll get to the illustrations later. There's a lot to talk about there. Thinking through soil. So thinking through is working it out, problematizing, which you've done with this amazing case study. Thinking about the ramifications and consequences of what you see in front of you. Through soil, you've demonstrated clearly that irrigation passes through soil, and in the case of the mezquital, it enriches the soil remarkably. And other things pass through the soil. We'll get back to that too. Seth and I and Karen Lee Barsinai are working on an edition of Harvard Design Magazine that will largely be around soil. It's called Ground. And I want to read something that Seth and Karen Lee devised as a part of the profile of our issue of the journal. Quoting now, for a biologist, the ground is soil, a layer barely 6 feet thick, sometimes much less, sometimes deeper, that contains life's most diverse and unexplored ecosystem. For climate scientists, the ground is a carbon bomb, big reservoir, hundreds of feet thick. That's the key to avoiding climate disaster. For a ceramicist, like my life partner, ground is a source of clay. For an investor, ground is property. For a planner, it's land to be managed. For an investor, for landscape architects, grounds are the medium of the work. My type is too small. I'll use my hand here. The medium, where did it go? Okay. For the architect, the ground has historically been a plinth for great works of design, but life on the business-as-usual climate curve has increasingly made this plinth itself an object of significant thought. The architects have caught on. In the current context in which we live, a more grounded orientation towards practice has become urgent, and the vast intersectional space that has emerged within and between these diverse conceptions of ground have increasingly become a thriving space for design thinking. So this is a nice intersection with something that we are doing currently in the department and with the press, and the arrival of this elegant book. And hats off to Chad and Willis for the qualities that I just described. In the book, you refer to Christina Lyon's vital decomposition. And that is, soil to a geologist is the decomposition of their medium, right? But what's particularly interesting about Christina Lyon's work is that she claims that the injustices that you saw in this case study are those of class, culture, race, and gender in the production of soil knowledge. And we referred to eugenics. And this is really a terrible part of the story. But could you elaborate on that? I mean, this is a eco-feminist critique, right? Yeah. Say more.
Yeah. So, what's really beautiful about Christina Lyon's book is Christina also helps us understand how the production of soil knowledge itself became a kind of gendered and classed project, and that's in a large part through the kind of misinterpretation of tropical soils by soil scientists who are trained in temperate climates. So she spends a lot of time educating us about what the litter layer does in an Amazonian soil, and if you're not from a part of the world that has a litter layer, you don't even really consider that a layer in a soil profile. So we have this kind of great reciprocity with her work in some sense, because you could see that, well, Christina Lyons doesn't do drawings, but if she did, she would have drawn the litter layer. And we would see the soil, and then she would have drawn the litter layer, and she would say, look, this is part of the profile. So we have this great kind of affinity with her work, because in some sense, we're doing exactly the same thing. We're just redrawing the soil and saying all this other stuff that isn't actually considered to be part of the soil, isn't part of soil science as a discipline, needs to be considered and needs to be understood to be part of the soil itself. So it's we also draw a lot on the work of Karen Barad, a feminist materialist scholar, who really helps us understand how there's a way of thinking about agency as matter and interaction. So agency as not this kind of individual act of willing, but agency that actually comes through the interaction of multiple different agencies as a different way of thinking about the production of agency. Which is crucial to how we draw soil, because in some sense, nothing about any of these individual characters means anything apart from their interaction with all the other characters. That's part of what we're trying to explain. It's very complex. I mean, we have an index in the back of the book that's like 45 of these characters. Each one does different things. Each one has a different history. Each one is itself not an object, but a process. And then we're trying to explain the interaction of these 45 different things in a soil. So it's difficult, but this kind of feminist approach to matter, I think, became really important for us in thinking through how we would explain matter in interaction, or the emergence of agency, the soil doing things through interactions, through distributed agencies, a distributed concept of agency, rather than this kind of object-oriented approach.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you. So it leads to my next question, a comment and a question. What you call, in the introduction to the book, the paradox of representation. Okay, this is a big topic. In the books that I mentioned in my office, if there are drawings, they're raster drawings, because you're looking at soil, let's say, at an enlarged scale, what soil actually looks like, right? Now, the paradox of representation is how to represent soil as both object and as process. You just mentioned it, right?
Yeah.
Your choice, and I've known about this for a while, because when I sat in on your course here 6 or 7 years ago, I I learned about your way of drawing this, and it didn't surprise me because I know about Tat and line weight. She has set the standard for line weights. We still follow here. But I was surprised at the drawings, and I think I said, I feel a little bit distanced from soil. Now I feel differently having read the book. Because I understand that in all the books on my shelf, we're looking at something that looks like the result of, what's the term, decomposition from parent material that is largely geologic. What you propose is that there are more other ingredients than silt, sand, and clay that are vital to the human use of soil to grow abundant food crop, to make a breadbasket, as it were. So I now know I'm seeing the parent material, and the scale shift is odd in a way because it doesn't look like the soil horizons. And here's the early version of, we wouldn't say rasterized, but we would say painted, right? That shows the process of things moving through soil, right? And you also reference this painting and say that, well, this is a way of portraying the story, erasing the painting and repainting, right? And this, I think, is the strong metaphor that is illustrated in these drawings. So now I want you to say more about that.
Should I go with line weight? No.
We had to bring you to line weight.
So I think one way to think about this is that when soils, and also Seth did this in his MLA thesis, and before that probably I didn't know anything about soil. It's the soil classification and how you look at the soil is depending who is your audience. And most of the times are farmers and what farmers need. But now, as you said, we are landscape architects, or maybe we are, I don't know, we could say human geographers. And those people see the soil beyond that materiality. Most of our disciplines need to see the soil beyond the materiality of let's grow something here, even if we need to. And also, they want to understand what is a site. And I would say with this type of soil profiles, you deeply understand. You carve the story of what is that site, that it's beyond that nice color, red, that brings the oxide. No, that is the result of mining, for instance. Now that we are in Missouri and we have lots of projects along railways, we have learned this, no? So this is a way to trace back and what that transformation and what really, to me, what I really like about this type of representation is that by bringing certain of these objects, you actually understand how the built environment is shaped, that at the end of the day, we are designers and we want to take that into account, not for just what it's there, how we will move forward. No? So we carry almost form without formalizing. Probably, I think it's okay. We are a good combination, but at the same time, we are very different, as you can probably notice by now.
One is Catalan, and one is not.
Yes. We keep making fun and saying, when we present this in Mexico, and I speak Spanish, you will see how smart I will look like. Sorry, but is this? I was always confronted in the book with Seth. I was like, what do we say also to the designers? Because I think this book is about the hope that we have on reading these sites, and then bringing them back. It's not you are not needing that for designing in the Mezquital. That maybe you will never do that. But you need this understanding and this approach to sites in order to project in many of them. So this is why the second part we said, this is a methodology because we think that obviously drawing is our media and then our language. So having our own way of draw complex processes it was important in the book, obviously, because it's a super complex subject. I don't know if this answers
That's
your
beautiful.
question.
Thank you. Thank you. Just one other topic, and then we'll open it up for questions, so be ready. I want to talk about the place of soil in landscape architecture curriculum, because one of the very first things you said today was you moved towards soil because you detected a complete absence of it in curriculum, right? So now Tat comes from this amazing intellectual tradition, which I'm going to outline, and Seth is also tied to it. Starts with Manuel de Solà Morales and the UPC in Barcelona, who studied here with José Luis Sert. And there was another important figure, Manuel Rivas Pierres. So this combination of people who were truly urbanists, but who understood the role of the horizontal plane in the making of the city, right? Understood the horizontality of the city, and that meant the ground, that meant the medium of landscape architecture. And I think Manuel de Solà at first put up with landscape architecture and then finally endorsed it. And then we have the descendants, Rosa Barba, Jordi Belmont, Manolo Ruiz Sanchez, Enrique Baillet, the list goes on, Bet Gali, Maria Gola, who's at Cornell now, Teresa Galiazard at ETH, and you and Lorena.
Yeah.
All that amazing knowledge transfer and knowledge creation coming out of a single institution and, frankly, revolutionizing landscape architecture in the Mediterranean. So I grant you that.
I think, okay, so thank you for this, but where I really learned landscape is in the US. You are.
But you were
the
prepared.
ones. Yes, you are the ones, because like every time, like I'm with you, Seth, without you, I have to say this, without you and my first encounter with Teresa, Julie Barman, and Beth Mayer, like at UBA, that blew my mind. I remember the first time that I took you to those parks in Barcelona, you thought, maybe this is not what landscape architecture is. That it's like, this is all I have to offer. So in here, if we go back to soil, and in the way that landscape architecture is taught here, with obviously the tradition of Olmsted, like you really look into the soil. Maybe what we have brought here is this technicality in the soil, no? Like that we want to draw through lines or through, I think, for instance, in your case, Seth, your undergrad in biology, obviously it's always this incredible source of knowledge that you can now bring into the, the human geography. I think it's like, but again, thank you for this lineage, but I feel like that what I learned here in the US about landscape, it's not really what is now teaching in Europe, you know? So it's like, I know we will say ETH.
Except now it is in the ETH.
Exactly. But what I'm saying is that this is not the tradition, and I think it's super relevant. In fact, I don't even know if people, I want your thinking set on this, if people in Europe will really understand this book. Because I think it's very relevant for the time that we are living in the way that we are teaching soils now, at least in the soil curriculums, I think, in the landscape curriculum, sorry, we teach soil in US. What are your thoughts, I think?
Shout out to Teresa Gali.
No.
Yeah.
No.
Hope she's listening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You should say more, but I also want to say that my encounters with soil in curriculum started with a workshop with Phil Krall in the 80s at Harvard Forest. And in the 90s, he came and taught for, as I say, about a dozen years. Very generous of him. And then we didn't have soil. We would occasionally have a visitor teach soil as part of our early semesters of the Ecologies, Techniques, and Technologies sequence. More recently, partly influenced by you two, Karen Janowski has now begun to teach soils. Now, Karen has an incredible career building soil or organizing soil, managing soil, specifying and designing it. And so we have what I like to think of as a practice-based course. It has a little bit of science, a little bit of theory, and mainly a lot of case studies in practice. What's the place of soil in the curriculum for you? What's the best way to deliver it and to make sure that students don't encounter what you did?
Yeah, it's really true. My interest in the subject really came from a kind of perceived missing course in my landscape architecture degree. And I mean, I think the really important thing to do is to think about soil not as a separate subject from all of our other subjects, that it's this kind of technical thing, this technical object that we have to master. Soil is a black box. Like, people don't know that much about it. You know, I mean, it's the understanding of microbial life in the soil is at its absolute infancy. Our ability to understand
30 years.
Yeah, generously. Obviously, some of that has been influenced by the ability to actually see that microbial life through the emergence of gene sequencing technology, you know, really just in the early 2000s. So I think it's really important to understand that when we think about soil, we almost think like, oh yes, that old discipline of soil science. No, it's actually completely new, and someone needs to think about how we're going to incorporate all of this new soil knowledge into the way in which we work. And that has to happen now, and it's a new project. It's not an old project. So we're really at the kind of dawn, we're at the beginning of a long moment, I hope a long moment, of rethinking or beginning to think for the first time about how we might integrate soil into our way of perceiving our environments, designing our environments, critiquing our environments, right? Part of what we argue in the book is that everything that we have done in this research is towards the imagination of a future, what we call a fourth horizon. We describe the 3 horizons that the book created, and then we're trying to imagine the fourth. But in order to imagine the fourth, we can't just make it. We have to actually reimagine the social relations, the political relations, the material relationships that would form that fourth horizon. There's no object or machine that could produce that fourth horizon. It's a set of processes that has to change. So producing that fourth horizon is an act of collaboration. It's a collaborative act. There's a social act. It's a collective act, right? And so we need a way to start imagining the design of collective, hybrid objects that are also alive and separate from us, right? So it's an entirely new way of interacting with environmental knowledge in a way that I hope doesn't also replicate the kind of techniques of mastery that have really defined our 20th century relationships to soil.
Wow, that's fantastic. In practice, we have to fight for a lot of things in order to build something beautiful and well and durable. And I would say our toughest fights over costs are around soil. But there's a shift, and I think soil is going to cost less in the future because we're going from a period of 20 years of manufacturing soil from different components to different specifications, sometimes 10 different specifications on a site. But the interest is growing. Karen's course has covered this towards, in a way, back to additive rather than removal and manufacturing of soil. And so this is another proof, in a sense, of the growing importance of the soil. Why plant if we can't have the right soil? Okay, it's 1:30. We have till 2. I want to say that getting this kind of audience when there's only about 3 days of classes left and final reviews are looming, is a tribute to you, to, and the subject, the topic. So thanks for that.
And our audience.
Okay, now,
Yeah.
questions from the audience. Diane, please.
Diane.
I promise there's a question at the end. But it's just starting with congratulations. I just can't wait to get the book. And this was just an amazingly beautiful presentation and a tribute to your work, but also with Gary to the amazing work that comes out of the landscape program. So I'm just love this presentation. What I really liked, I wanna make a comment that brings yet another department, not just landscape, but like urban planning and design into the presentation, and we'll end with a question that maybe help us think that through. I really appreciated this starting with the historical understanding of the flows with the drenaje profundo from Mexico City to the valley and back and forth. So I'm interested in the territoriality, the larger territoriality in which you've landed then back with these kind of graphics of the soil. And I want us to keep in mind the horizontality in the valley, and not just the verticality of how we look at the soil and the soil as a composite of all these things. So I guess my question is, could you say a little bit more about how seeing the soil or visioning the soil helps us understand that historical territorial connectivity? So in particular, again, these beautiful graphics about what ends up in the soil is a consequence of those flows of the production and consumption between the Leviathan, Mexico City, and the valley of farmers. So I guess, could you talk a little bit more about the way this methodology you're using tells us something new about that political ecology, I would use that word, of the relationships between the city and its hinterland? Because even the protest of the farmers is a consequence of this crazy interaction that you said, Seth, is reinterpreted as a positive and negative things at different historical moments. So that's the question, and just one embellishment to that, because both of you ended talking about this fourth horizon. I'm wondering if you understood a little bit more the kind of relationality of what's landing in the soil, that the soil has more agency than you're giving it. That in what ends up in there through that relationality, that produces the fourth horizon, as opposed to you thinking what should be in that soil. Do you see what I'm saying? So is there something embedded in the soil that forecloses some options but creates other options that will produce that fourth horizon?
Okay, so this always from the very, very beginning, this project starts by saying that the pipe disconnects these two places that are deeply connected, no? And the entire project is saying which type of city we need in order to make a better soil, or which type of farmers we need that are ready to take 20 million people's sewage and making it into agriculture. So I think these two critical questions that from the very beginning the project in the studios, in the way that we are thinking, is that you think at two places, they are linked. Not because it's this 100 meters deep pipe that connects them, they are not disconnected. One emerges to the other, and then when the vegetables are done, they go back to Mexico City. So that, and then they go back to the sewage. And it's like this reciprocal relationship, no? So from the beginning, I think the fourth horizon also starts thinking about, in all these pharmacies, if you are not, for instance, familiar in Mexico City, that they sell, all the, you visit the doctor at the same place that they sell you all these medicines, no? So it's known that there is two types, as I was mentioning, two types of antibiotics. So depending on what you give them, it's another type of output. So it's like maybe it's new policies on that. So our fourth horizon, it's a compound of ideas. Some of them are policies, some of them are direct actions that maybe you would do in the in Mesquital Valley in order to, flow the water differently or understand the composition of the water and then take different decisions from the farming. I don't know if this is what but maybe.
And there was one other, when you were asking for like, is there one thing that opens some doors and forecloses others? And I think the thing for that in the Mesquital is this very paradoxical condition where the amount of heavy metals that the soil can bind in order to prevent those metals from becoming bioavailable to plants depends on how much organic matter there is in the soil. So the same wastewater that brings the organic matter brings the heavy metals. So the wastewater is actually increasing the soil's capacity to bind heavy metals as it's depositing more heavy metals. But of course, if you think about those as kind of like parking spaces, right? When does the parking lot fill up? And when it does, then the metals become bioavailable. And that's really everything that we're trying to imagine in this fourth horizon is trying to figure out a way that this very precarious soil, which has a legacy load of heavy metals, which can't be erased, and that's the thing about soil that I think, Gary, you'd appreciate very much, is that there's no tabula rasa with soil. You work with what you have, and there's no going back. It's no clean slate. Even if everyone wants to change and do things differently now, we have a century worth of deposition in that soil to manage in the very delicate and precarious chemistries of these soils. So when we think about a fourth horizon, we are thinking about how to walk that tightrope. And it's, as you say, with the soil, and the soil is doing all of that work. It's binding the metals for us. And right now, the soil meets international standards for heavy metal concentrations, even though it's been taking the untreated sewage of Mexico City for a century. If the soil was sandy, it would have been a Superfund site 40 years ago. But it's not, it's clay. So the soil has this incredible capacity. It's called cation exchange capacity to bind heavy metals.
Get scientific here.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, I'm going to nerd out on this if you don't stop me. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Wow.
Maybe there is maybe one thing that going back to the soil, I think soil is labor. And sometimes, when we do projects, it's like, bring me the soil. No, the soil, we learn in the Mesquital, is labor. It's making the terraces and trapping what it's eroding and then planting the magueys that then can filter this very little water. So it's like soil is labor, and we no longer understand labor in making our places, no? So then what we stand now for, no? Maybe you are gardening and you care a lot, but still, and also soil is labor and it's generations, no? Because our friend soil scientist, the first time that she said that, every time that you scoop in your garden, you are removing 70 years of soil formation. And it's like my life is in every school. So this means that it's labor and time. So it's like in the Mesquital Valley, maybe things happen very slowly, but at the same time, they are waiting for this long time, to stand and be there, and the generations that are coming. And I think this is important because knowing lots of places, we have this idea that we will wait, this idea that it's a long-term project and you are doing this for next generations, not even for you. And I think that is important as an attitude, I think, also towards design, obviously, no? And in the time that we are living.
Diane, somewhere in the book, I can't pass this up, somewhere in the book, the quote, the Otumi, saying this, they send us turds and we give them squash in return. Mm-hmm. That sums it up.
Yeah.
Questions? Becca?
Thank you so much for this. I love that we've ended on this drawing, and maybe it's also because I'm in the throes of production right now, but I can't help but notice the lack of a section line in this drawing. And I wonder, I imagine that it's a conscious choice, and I wonder how much you feel like the absence of this line is liberating for maybe this future design process or someone looking at these drawings, or if even the the scale or the level of abstraction that we're looking at is actually like the thickened section line. But I'd love if you could maybe speculate or elaborate on that decision.
Yeah, thanks for that. The drawings actually do have layers. And so part of what we're hoping that you see over the course of the book is that the profile in chapter 1 gets modified slightly in chapter 2, and then modified again slightly in chapter 4. And that as the drawing, in some sense, changes, you can see the emergence of layers and horizons within that. So we are imagining this as a soil profile, and you're right to wonder, what is the scale of this soil profile? And, you know, I resisted specifying exactly what the scale of it was, because it is so abstract in the sense that it's drawn as processes, not as objects. But the objects do actually correspond to where those processes change the soil profile in a horizon, a vertical dimension. So you can actually see that by the third or fourth horizon, those kind of Otomi indigenous soil practices are buried further and further down in the horizon, and you only see them at the bottom. Whereas wastewater agriculture and those processes have taken place at the top of the horizon. And so you can see the kind of chronology of how the soil has been changing in a sectional way. So it is meant to be read as a section, but there is no section line. Yeah.
But also the line, I would say that, no, the line is an abstraction, no? It's just the density of the air and the density of the material, no? So sometimes, for instance, I think I'm an architect and I moved to landscape architecture, and in architecture it's very clear. You have glass in here, you have, you have materials with edges and you can decide what it's inside. In the crust of earth, it's very uncertain how much air you have, no? So I think it's important that in fact the line of the section disappears as a line, because that exchange exists. We talk about porosity. No, it's finding the way to not draw the line, I think, what should be important, that the soil profiles, I think, do it very exaggerated, but it's the stance, I think, no? That these lines is an invention, and for landscape architects, and maybe for hopefully for other disciplines, would not exist. And that is the power, I think, and obviously the drawings are doing it very well, I think.
Karen?
So when I first saw the book, I had this sort of visceral reaction to it, that it was like, oh, of course, it's sort of it's decomposing when I look at it. It was just like my first thought of it when Gary showed it to me. And so I'm so excited to hear that actually was maybe what you were trying to do. And so maybe that's for one thing to comment on. And I'm glad that Gary has sort of picked up on the fact that it differs.
Will become soil.
yes. And I love that Gary sort of brought up the fact that it really does differ from other textbooks in that way. So that's just really poignant to me personally. I wanted to ask you about something that I guess it's more of a personal indulgence to ask you this, right? And it's something about that I've been thinking about a lot, and you're making me think about more through the book. And that is, I think about the process of making landscapes and the nursery industry and the growing medium that is used. And I'm trying to fit it into this drawing and that extraction process where we take a material from the ground out, and then we blend it with other things. In one case, I was working with a client where they were taking the boxes that they were growing trees in by the thousands, grinding them up, and then mixing them with some other things that were probably taken from the ground, adding some compost, and then this was becoming the growing medium for those trees. Thousands
Nails
of them.
and all. Nails and all.
Nails and all. And then placing that in the ground. And so in my mind, at that point, it is considered a growing medium and not a soil. And so I've been thinking about where does this line lie between a living soil and this mere growing medium? And some of the research that Hilderbrand did that I thought was really fascinating was when you went through some of your built projects and looked at the soils and found that horizons were developing through the plants that were planted there. So you were taking this growing medium and doing it. So I'm wondering what you how you might place this into your thinking.
Yeah, I think the difference is just time. So plants have spent, 2.6 billion years trying to figure out how to grow in soil. And then we want to put them in something else. If we want to do that, we better make sure that the thing that we put them in approximates to some degree the amount of air, the amount of water, the sense of structure, or the kind of physical capacity of that soil to retain moisture, to dry out. So everything we do in creating artificial soils is about finding creative ways to mimic the properties of actual soils. And when it works, it's great, and over time horizons develop, and over time it becomes soil. When it doesn't work, it's because we haven't understood time. It approximates those conditions in the first year. In the second year, it's worse. In the third year, it's really bad, right? And then, you can, and so I think that's just the kind of missing ingredient that separates those things is, I would say, just time.
Yeah. But also it's like when every time that we talk about and we put soil, and Christina it's our soil scientist.
Christina Siba is our, shout out to Christina Siba. She taught us a lot about soil. Yeah.
This is substrate.
Substrate.
Yes,
Yeah.
just to be clear, this is not soil. Where is the life activity? What is time? What is weather? And it's like, okay. So she always gives these 5 minutes. We have had it in our class, no? She gives the 5 minutes as, this, guys, is soil. The rest call it other things, no? So I think part of what happens here is that we also not even know exactly what soil is, even if we use it as media, as a discipline, for instance, no? So it's like, let's, no? So this is why, if we go back to the idea of where we do in curriculums, no? It's like all these students that decide to go to a science department to take soils class, to then have a totally different understanding that probably it's far from what they would apply, but it's more clearly affecting the work that they are doing every day in a studio, for instance, or in other research that they are doing. And I think this is kind of important, and maybe this is also what the book wants to explain, no? That the disciplines are all kept together, and as designers, if you read this book as a designer, you understand that there are multiple disciplines that you also have to take in account, and sometimes it's very overwhelming because it's not your discipline, but you have to add it in order to have this chaotic vision of how you move forward projects, designs, or ideas that you want to explain.
Thank you. We have time for one or two more. Okay, we'll hand it over to Ken. I think we will.
Wow, it's very difficult.
Well, thank you all three for a wonderful program. I should have said this at the very beginning, but in case it's not clear, books, while we don't have them for sale in person, are on pre-order over there at the table to your left. I would also just make some kind of a note about independent booksellers. Any independent bookseller that you go to can place a pre-order of this book and have it ready for you by the release date in early June. Yesterday we had a post on Instagram that gave a very short but global list of some of our favorites. So if you're planning on buying a book and you don't buy it today, maybe visit your local shop and show your support to them. So thank you to Gary and Seth and Tad. Congratulations again on the project, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you.